It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the bow was invented. Stone arrowheads found in South Africa suggest it could be over 60,000 years ago. However, Paleolithic hunters in Eurasia primarily used spears and atlatls. The bow became popular in the Mesolithic period as the climate changed and large game like mammoths disappeared, leading to a hunting crisis. This new weapon likely opened up new opportunities for hunting birds, small animals, and even fish, essential for survival in this changing world. And here's an interesting point. Humans in the Stone Age already knew how to work wood and make natural fibers. By the Upper Paleolithic at least, all the tech needed to craft much later designs, like the English longbow or composite bow, was already there. The only real question might be about natural adhesives, like those made from fish swim bladders. But even those were likely known. Still, despite being older than civilization itself, the bow evokes mixed feelings. On one hand, its range, precision, and rate of fire have been praised endlessly. On the other hand, when we picture ancient warriors, we think of Greek hoplites with spears, Roman legionaries with gladi and pila, Vikings with swords and axes, or medieval knights charging with lances. The bow, though widely used, is mostly associated with English archers and nomadic horsemen. I'm probably part of the last generation whose childhood was spent without computers, internet, or smartphones. Back then, we made makeshift bows and other crafts. Later, with video games, I often played as an archer in various titles. Overall, I've always liked bows, and even tried using them as a student, but over time, I've come to reevaluate their effectiveness. About 15 years ago, when students in my history department discussed this weapon, we'd cite fragments of historical accounts that now make me smile. For example, Gerald of Wales told of an arrow piercing a knight's thigh, his saddle, and then killing the horse, supposedly proving incredible armor-piercing power. Whether such sources are reliable is another question, but it's worth noting this story dates back to the 12th century before plate armor existed. Similarly, the church's bans on bows and crossbows also belong to that era. You'll also hear claims like, English longbows could pierce solid oak gates. And then there's the 100 Years' War, where English archers are often credited as night-killing cavalry destroyers. The bow undeniably had advantages. First, rate of fire. It depends entirely on the archer's skill. Some could shoot an arrow per second. Realistically, though, most combat bows managed about 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Second, range. This depends on the bow's power and the arrow's design. Typically, a lighter arrow could reach just over 200 meters. At around 90 meters, a trained archer could reliably hit specific targets. So the bow seems amazing, right? But as we know, firearms started to take over in the 15th century. Even as late as the 17th or 18th centuries, smoothbore guns, fixed in place for accuracy tests, only hit targets 50% of the time at 100 meters. Some tests recorded 7 misses for every 10 shots. These findings come from tests of 14 firearms in the Austrian Weapon Museum in Graz. Their rate of fire was about 2 shots per minute, 5 to 6 times slower than a bow. What's fascinating is that bows were phased out not by reliable firearms, but by weaker muskets in the 16th century, and even earlier by lighter 15th century arquebuses, which often struggled to penetrate armor. Even in England, where archers became cultural icons and remained in use the longest, a decision was made in 1589 to abandon bows in favor of firearms. So the question is, if bows were so effective, why switch to slower, less accurate guns? The first thought might be the difficulty of mastering the bow, but there wasn't much need for specialized schools to train archers. It was handled differently. King Richard II, for instance, issued a decree requiring people to practice archery on holidays and Sundays instead of playing football or other games. It kicked off a sort of mainstream movement. From there, it was just a matter of traveling to towns and villages to recruit the best archers. While the bow is undeniably tricky to master, it was far more familiar to medieval folks than to us today. Moreover, in England, where the bow was ingrained in the culture, finding skilled archers was never an issue. The claim that the bow fell out of favor due to its difficulty is challenged by the rise of another weapon, the crossbow. Crossbows are easier to use than bows, yet more powerful. As Manière de Morlaix wrote, a skilled crossbowman could hit a chicken egg from 100 paces. Lever-action crossbows fired about 4 bolts per minute. So here's a weapon that's simpler to learn, more accurate, and faster firing than early guns. And yet by the 16th century, it too was replaced by firearms. First off, let's clear something up. Using a bow in real life is quite different from what we see in movies or games. For example, you can't keep a bow strung all the time. Its limbs lose tension over time. Plus, bowstrings don't handle moisture well. though people treated them with beeswax to help. Arrows are another complicated topic. In the Mesolithic, when bows became widespread, arrowheads were made of stone, often in the form of geometric microliths, small flint segments shaped like trapezoids or triangles. When copper appeared about 7,000 years ago, followed by bronze, people didn't immediately make arrowheads from metal. It was too valuable to waste on something easily lost, so arrowheads remained mostly stone or bone. By the first millennium BCE, as the Iron Age began, bronze lost its importance, and older bronze, not the less valuable iron, that was repurposed for crafting ammunition. For example, the Scythians used tiny, lightweight bronze arrowheads. At the same time, bone arrowheads persisted well into the Middle Ages. Some sources even suggest that medieval arrows were sometimes made from cheaper, lower-quality steel. And unlike in video games, where arrows cost next to nothing, the reality was very different. On average, an archer carried about 50 arrows. In the 13th and 14th centuries, a dozen arrows cost around 15 pence, meaning 50 arrows cost 75 pence, or over 6 shillings. To put that in perspective, in the 13th century, that could buy a cow, and in the 14th century, 2 pigs or 5 sheep. Essentially, 1 minute of shooting from a single archer cost the same as a barrel of ale, 60 to 70 liters. It wasn't always easy to recover arrows after a battle. Situations varied. An archer's stock rarely exceeded 100 arrows, and the reason wasn't just cost. Arrows were quite heavy by modern standards, usually weighing between 50 and 80 grams. That means a full quiver could easily weigh over 5 kilograms, though arrows were often delivered in bundles on the battlefield. For example, records from Edward III in the mid-14th century show that the Tower of London stored 11,000 bows and just over 500,000 arrows, around 50 arrows per bow. Or consider the Mary Rose shipwreck. 137 bows were found alongside 3,500 arrows, about 25 arrows per bow. So, while archers were quick shooters, they could burn through their expensive ammunition in just a few minutes of fighting. By the 15th to early 16th century, when the bow was losing its edge, metal had become cheaper and the economic factor became less important. After all, bullets, gunpowder, and firearm barrels weren't exactly cheap either. So why did firearms ultimately take over? It's worth mentioning that while the bow spread widely about 12,000 years ago with the onset of the interglacial period, it didn't reach everywhere. For example, the people of Australia and several neighboring islands didn't use it, and not because they didn't know about the weapon. The tribes in Cape York were familiar with the bows and arrows of neighboring island tribes, but they didn't adopt them, believing their spears were better for combat, and that didn't stop them from surviving until today. Thanks to some 19th century authors who gained credibility simply because their works were written a long time ago, as well as modern fantasy stories and films, many still believe that bows and crossbows can pierce any kind of armor. However, dozens of experiments available today show that even crossbows, with draw weights measured in hundreds of kilograms, are usually ineffective against a cuirass that's only about 2 millimeters thick, and that's considering the shots are fired from fairly close range. The bow, on the other hand, often proves powerless even against fabric-based armor. And even when arrows did penetrate armor, it didn't guarantee serious injury. Expensive armor wasn't just for show, despite what some movies imply. For context, a bow with a draw weight of 36 kilograms, a solid but not exceptional weapon, could shoot a 50-gram arrow at 50 meters per second, with an initial kinetic energy of 62 joules. The most powerful bows reached around 100 joules of initial energy, but arrows lose energy quickly due to their shape. Compare that to a TT pistol, which delivers over 500 joules, or an AK rifle, which outputs about 2,000 joules. Some say being hit by an AK round feels like being hit with a sledgehammer, but that's not entirely accurate. To put it simply, it's like a sledgehammer strike moving at a speed of around 5 to 6 kilometers per hour, while the actual strike with this tool can reach over 25 kilometers per hour. So, the movie scenes where an arrow physically knocks a person off their feet are pure fantasy. The bow, despite its advantages, is primarily a weapon that causes injury. In my opinion, its lethality today is greatly overestimated, and ideas about its effectiveness somewhat echo the myths surrounding the katana's extraordinary properties. If we recall famous figures who fell to arrows from a bow or crossbow like Richard the Lionheart, King Harold II of England, or Harald Hardrada of Norway, all of them died from an arrow to the neck or eye, during a time when full plate armor didn't even exist. In fact, the success of English archers in the Hundred Years' War is often linked to their ability to disable horses. As English historian Nicole wrote, a knight only had to tilt his head for arrows to bounce off his helmet and shoulder plates. They would strike the knight's horses in the hindquarters or neck, causing them to collapse. It's also important to note that at longer ranges, both bows and crossbows were fired in an arc. If the enemy wasn't packed as tightly as a subway crowd, most arrows would simply stick in the ground. Meanwhile, a bullet could travel much farther with minimal loss of height, and as it passed through the enemy's formation, it had a higher chance of hitting someone. Overall, the main advantage of slower, less accurate firearms wasn't so much their ability to penetrate armor, but their ability to inflict truly horrific and often lethal wounds. A bullet fired from an arquebus traveled at 300 to 400 meters per second. Thanks to its relatively large caliber and decent weight, the muzzle energy was about 2,000 joules, about the same as an AK-47's bullet. The only difference was that a larger bullet fired from smoothbore weapons lost that energy much faster. Early muskets were almost like anti-tank rifles. A 50-gram bullet at 400 meters per second had around 4,000 joules of muzzle energy. While early firearms weren't the most accurate or fast, their sheer destructive power was overwhelming for their time. By the 15th and early 16th centuries, when firearms started to replace bows and crossbows, there was still no linear tactics or large groups of shooters firing volleys. This period, marking the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern era, also saw the Moscow state aggressively expanding eastward, while other European nations pursued active colonial policies. Encounters between unprotected troops armed with the early smoothbore firearms of Europeans and archers, nomads, and other groups using traditional weapons usually ended badly for the latter. The deadly power of the bullet proved to be more important than the rate of fire or even the accuracy of the arrow.